All right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we're doing something a bit different. So I thought I was going to get a bit of a break for the time being, but apparently not. So I've had some rescheduling to do with some of the guests that I had planned for October. Most of them are still going to be going on, just maybe a little bit later on. And so that's kind of messed up my plans to have a bit of a break. So I'm going to delay my break and I'm going to give you guys new content for the next 1 or 2 weeks. Basically just kind of bonus fluff shows that aren't taking a lot of hard work or effort to bring on. But it's still something that's interesting. So for example, for today, I TA'd for Class Cray, a brilliant prof that I love. He's an expert in the philosophy of religion. He's a Christian philosopher, a fellow Christian. And he's an expert in the philosophy of religion in particular. And I was lucky enough to TA for him and his philosophy of religion class for first year university students. So he did a great job kind of outlining some of the historical or traditional versions of various arguments for God's existence, arguments against God's existence, and that sort of thing. And I think he did a well enough job that I want to share it with you guys. Kind of an easy thing. I don't need to do a lot of prep work. He's already done a lot of the work for me. And I just want to share some of his efforts on that front. So in this episode, I want to look at some of the traditional cosmological arguments. I did my own very in-depth and well-researched study on the cosmological argument. As you guys know, there's 3 versions. There's the Kalam cosmological argument. There are Leibnizian cosmological arguments, or arguments from the contingency of the universe. And then there are prime mover type cosmological arguments and that sort of thing. And I took on the Leibnizian cosmological argument in my 5-part series, kind of adopting that used by William Lane Craig and Stephen T. Davis, and I kind of modified it a little bit myself, but that was very in-depth, very scholarly level. This is going to be a little bit more popular level and looking at some of the precursors, the traditional cosmological arguments. So I want to look at Thomas Aquinas, in particular his second way, and then Samuel Clarke later on in the 17th or 18th centuries, and his cosmological argument there. And just take a quick look. Nothing too in depth or anything like that, and just give you guys some historical perspective on a couple of cosmological arguments. And if I have nothing for next week, then maybe we'll look at a design argument. I've never done that. In particular, I'll look at William Paley and his argument, because he gets mocked a lot by atheist skeptics who, they're just ignorant. They kind of, evolution's refuted that guy, he was an imbecile. Yeah, well, we'll find out. But yeah, so that's the plan for today. I'm going to keep going and have brand new RSM content until I get those October guests, Barry Schwartz, Joseph Bergeron, and wow, I forgot. Can't remember. Well, I've got something scheduled with Guy Powell. He's going to be interviewing me on his show on the Shroud of Turin, the backstory on the Shroud. And obviously, I'll be posting that up once that goes up on my Real Seekers channel for you guys. Jack Symes has had to delay, so he won't be until January, assuming all goes to plan for talking with him. There's somebody else. John Loken. Again, he'll be late October, early November sometime. So yeah, we'll see what goes on with those special guest shows. But yeah, with that said, I want to get into these traditional or historical versions of the cosmological argument. So let me get into that. Oh, and it'll be interesting, actually, just before I stop, pause the recording there. It'll be interesting. So I'm trying out a video version of a solo show just to see how it goes. So obviously I'll be recording in bits and pieces, so it might look a bit disjointed. I won't always be with the continuity, but yeah, all right, let's see how it goes. I just want to experiment. All right, so into the cosmological arguments. Okay, so Here I can share my screen and bada boom, bada bing. Okay, perfect. So so in terms of cosmological arguments here, Thomas, as everyone knows, there are different types of arguments for God's existence. Why the heck is this not popping up? There are a priori arguments, and there are a posteriori arguments. So one just means, okay, so I've got to do it. Basically, with a posteriori arguments, that's arguing after experience or with evidence. And that's where the cosmological argument fits in. We're arguing from the existence of the world or some fact about the world, such as motion or whatever, to the existence of God. There are also a priori arguments. So that's something like the ontological argument. So just kind of going over one argument, there's the Kalam cosmological argument that's famous by Dr. William Craig. That's the argument I didn't use in my 5-part series on the cosmological argument, but just to kind of take a quick little glance at what that is and how that works. So, this is Kalam, comes from an Arabic word, but it goes, look, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. Very simple argument. It's a logically valid argument patterns in quantificational logic or predicate logic. It's called the universal modus ponens argument pattern. And this is valid, right? So we have follows the structure, all A's are B's, X is an A, therefore X is a B, and you have the little circle chart here. So you can see, well, X is a part of the circle A, right? That's premise 2, X is an A, yep, that fits. And we know that all A's, the A circle is within the overall B circle. So all A's are B's. Well, therefore we know since X is an A, X is also a B. It fits within that circle. And this is a valid argument pattern known as universal modus ponens within deductive arguments. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so I'll skip over this because again, we're not going to evaluate the Kalam cosmological argument here. I want to move on to Thomas Aquinas. And let's start with, Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas, he had his famous 5 ways in the medieval period. He was one of the most famous Christian philosophers that existed. And he came up with various, about 5 type of arguments for the existence of God. So for example, his first way deals with the argument from motion, a cosmological argument. There's motion in the universe and this requires a prime mover. Then there's the second way that we're going to be looking at in today's episode, which argues for an efficient cause of all things in nature. His third way looks at, well, there's possibility and necessity. There must be a necessary being, God, that explains all possibilities and that sort of thing. His fourth way deals with gradations and says, well, look, there are certain features of the world and there are various degrees of these properties and attributes. So there's a property of goodness that clearly exists in the world. There must be a maximal degree of that, right? So there must be a maximally good being, God, that exists. And then finally, his fifth way is an argument from design in nature. So as I said, we're going to be looking strictly at his second way, this argument for an efficient cause of the universe. So let me pop that up. Okay, so he existed in the medieval period. This comes from his book Summa Theologica. And I will be posting this up on my blog site so you guys can read all 5 of his ways in your own, with your own eyes. But yeah, it kind of goes reconstructing his argument into standard form. It's kind of like this. So premise 1, things in nature are caused to exist. And again, by caused, he's referring to specifically an efficient cause, because Thomas Aquinas is an Aristotelian, and he thinks there are 4 different types of causes: material, form, final cause, and efficient causes. But that doesn't really necessarily matter too much in terms of evaluating Thomas Aquinas's argument. So it's sufficient to just say, look, things in nature are caused to exist. The other thing to note with this premise is look at what it is. It's not talking about the universe or necessarily, or everything. It's talking specifically about things in nature. That's what he is evaluating here. He's saying things in nature are caused to exist. So premise 2 of his argument would be, if something caused itself to exist, then it would be prior to itself. So in other words, it would be self-caused or engage in self-causation of some sort. Premise 3 of his argument, but yet nothing is prior to itself. Self-causation is absolutely absurd according to Thomas Aquinas. So something can't cause itself to exist, or at the very least, things in nature is what he has in mind, can't cause themselves to exist. Therefore, conclusion, or premise 4, everything that is caused to exist is caused to exist by something external to it, by something else. Okay, so that's his first little sub-argument there. Then premise 5, either there is an infinite regress of causes, or there is one first cause. So that's his next premise. Okay. Premise 6, but yet an infinite regress of causes is impossible. So this is employing the disjunctive syllogism for premise 5 and 6, either A or B, not A, therefore B is how he's arguing. Therefore, there must be a first uncaused cause of the things in nature. And then final conclusion, premise or statement 8, therefore God exists. And this is represented by his famous statement in his paper, where he says right here at the end, he gets to his argument, and then he says, and therefore it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, statement 7 in the thing, right? And then he moves on to 8, to which everyone gives the name of God. So he jumps kind of from that efficient cause of the things of nature to that efficient cause being, in fact, God. So that's how his argument works here in a nutshell. Obviously, it's logically valid. He employs various deductive argument patterns that we know are valid. And it really comes down to a question, well, is this a logically sound argument? Or a better way to say it, because soundness just means, are these premises true? Is this a deductively strong argument, as Dr. Richard Feldman would put it, which means, are we rationally justified or warranted on a balance of probabilities in believing that these premises are true? And that's really where the disagreement about Aquinas's argument is going to come in. Okay. Evaluation of Thomas Aquinas. So obviously, the first thing that we just kind of mentioned is the inference from premise 7 or subconclusion 7 to the main conclusion 8. Obviously, this is invalid, right? Jumping straight from there is a first uncaused efficient cause for the things of nature, therefore God exists. God is that efficient uncaused cause. That's an invalid inference. It's possible that there is some other kind of efficient cause, right? He hasn't proven that with the premises he laid out. Even assuming all of these premises are true and some conclusions are true, you still can't derive and guarantee the conclusion that God exists. It's possible that, I don't know, Satan exists and he created all the things and caused all the things in nature, or an alien or whatever, right? So that's a key problem here that a lot of people bring out. Now, I would say, by way of response to that, though, I think that Thomas Aquinas is employing, even though he doesn't have the terminology, he's employing a properly basic belief. Look, once you logically derive this, that there is an efficient cause of all the things in nature, well, what else is left? That supernatural ultimate being, God. And it's a properly basic belief. Once you have that derived belief that there is an efficient cause of all things in nature, then you instantly and immediately get the people, or most people with properly functioning faculties, get this instant, properly basic belief, and that efficient cause is God. We just know it's God. That's what we call God. And I think that's what Thomas Aquinas is doing here. And that's how he's saying it's God. He's not trying to come up with a rational argument. He's just saying, look, it's once we get to this stage 7, it's immediately obvious that, yeah, and this thing in statement 7 that we're looking at, that's obviously God. And I know that in a properly basic way, which just means an immediate belief that is immediate, it's basic, it's not derived or inferred on the basis of other beliefs, but yet it's grounded in the experience of deriving this conclusion here. And that's fully warranted, as we learned with Dr. Elvin Plantinga, and we've done on some of the shows on epistemology. That's totally rational. That is warranted or justified in an epistemic sense, or at the very least it can be. Okay, so another objection to this argument is that it commits the birthday fallacy. So here we have only one cause. So this is another major issue for this argument. Basically, the birthday fallacy is just kind of saying, look, we all have birthdays, right? But does it really follow that we all have there's only one birthday? Like I'm born April 19th. Is everybody born on April 19th just because they all have birthdays? Or could there be multiple birth dates? Everyone has a different birthday or something like that. So this is what's philosophers call the birthday fallacy. And some people will say that Thomas Aquinas commits this. Hang on one second. Let me just see if I can. All right. All right. So we'll pick up. Sorry about that. I just had to check out something quickly. Okay. So going back to our slides here. So as I was saying, some atheists and skeptics have said that Aquinas' second way argument employs the birthday fallacy. So that goes from one cause, it assumes one cause rather than multiple causes or multiple efficient causes of all the things in nature. And this is a false assumption on Aquinas' part, atheists and skeptics will say. So basically, my retort to this is, yeah, this is complete bunk. To think that someone as brilliant as Thomas Aquinas would be so stupid and foolish to behave like a modern internet atheist and skeptic and would commit an obvious fallacy is ridiculous. You're just dumb and biased if you think that Thomas Aquinas would commit an obvious fallacy, I'm sorry to say. No, it's obvious from premises 5 and 6 that he's totally avoided this fallacy because he provides, look, in premise, let's go back. Okay. So premises 5 and 6, either there is an infinite regress of causes or there is a first cause. So this is that disjunctive syllogism. And premise 6 says, well, look, A is wrong. An infinite regress of causes is impossible. So the only option is there is a single first cause. So Thomas Aquinas is in fact addressing this, and he's narrowing it down to 2 options in this disjunctive syllogism that he has with premises 5 and 6 and conclusion 7. So he's not just committing a birthday fallacy. Now, someone might object to premise 5 here and say, my goodness, are there only those 2 options, or is there perhaps a third option? Could there be multiple first uncaused causes rather than one that's an infinite regress or something like that? But I just wanted to make it clear that it's not fair for atheists and skeptics to say that Thomas Aquinas is committing the birthday fallacy as though he's just totally oblivious. No, he thinks that he can get to the fact that there are only these 2 options. He can prove one of the options is false. So therefore, we know that it must be this singular first cause. Again, whether you disagree with those premises or not, we can get to that in a bit. That could be argued. And of course, that has been argued in subsequent centuries and that sort of thing. So another objection that atheists and skeptics like to give is about premise 6. Obviously, is it true that an infinite regress of causes is impossible? A lot of atheists and skeptics believe the universe is eternal. They try to come up with this notion that no, there could be one cause after another for all of eternity. Well, Thomas Aquinas, in his argument on the second way, he does provide a sub-argument for the truth of premise 6. And it basically goes like this. Premise A, an infinite series of causes has no first cause, obviously, because it's infinite. It just keeps going. You always have an infinite series of prior causes before any specific effect that you're looking at. Premise B, a series of causes with no first cause has no effects because you simply cannot get to that any given effect, given you will always have an infinite amount of prior causes. You can never get to effect 5,567, for example. No, there'll always be you'll always be stuck an infinite backwards thing. You could never get to any specific effect in the finite past if there was truly an infinite series of causes, and that's totally absurd. So therefore, an infinite series of causes is impossible. So this is kind of a sub-argument for the truth of premise 6 that Thomas Aquinas provides in his own argument here. Obviously, atheists and skeptics might doubt premise B, and they kind of say, well, it just begs the question, right? It's just kind of assuming the truth of the conclusion by assuming that this premise is true because the conclusion itself is true. So that's kind of a major objection to this sub-argument here for premise 6. But Thomas Aquinas later on kind of admits that for him, it's not really on the basis of this sub-argument that he believes premise 6 is true. It's really because of faith or revelation. By that I mean biblical scripture, inspired scripture of the Word of God. And I've included in here, or perhaps a PBB, a properly basic belief, might play a role here as well, that he knows that premise 6 is true. So again, I think Thomas Aquinas kind of drops the ball here. He says ultimately it's not because of reason, but it's because of revelation or scripture that he believes that an infinite series of causes is impossible. Okay, so I think I think that's it in terms of Thomas Aquinas, his argument that I wanted to say here. So after this, we'll move on to the next cosmological argument I wanted to evaluate, which was Samuel Clarke's version from the 17th and 18th century. So let me pull that up here. Just pause the recording or stop it for now. Why isn't this? Okay, so moving on to Samuel Clarke's argument. So basically, Samuel Clarke lived around 1675 to 1729, and he made a cosmological argument in his book called A Discourse Concerning the Being and Attributes of God. And that was based on a transcript of about 16 sermons that he did in the year between 1704 to 1705. And a key innovation with him is that unlike Thomas Aquinas or with the Kalam cosmological argument, he doesn't argue that, oh, there's a beginning of natural things or a beginning to the universe, as the Kalam says. No, he says, look, the universe or all natural things, they've always existed from eternity past. I'm not arguing for a first cause like Aquinas did. Instead, what he's trying to do is make this distinction between dependent or contingent and independent or self-existent beings. And on this basis, okay, so going on with Samuel Clarke's version of the cosmological argument. Samuel Clarke, he lived around between 1675 to 1729 in the 18th century. And he made a cosmological argument in his book called A Discourse Concerning the Being and Attributes of God. And this is kind of really a transcript of about 16 sermons that he preached in the years 1704 to 1705. And the key innovation he made here is, look, he's saying, I'm going to come up with a different type of cosmological argument. Thomas Aquinas, and also as we saw with the cosmological argument, they kind of argue for a first cause of the universe, or in Thomas Aquinas's case, for all the things in nature. He doesn't care about, no, it's all eternal. You can have this infinite regress of causes. Who cares? That's great, grand, and groovy, Mr. Atheist. But Samuel Clarke, being the brilliant Christian theist that he is, he tries to make a key distinction between dependent or contingent beings and independent or self-existent beings like God. And in this way, he's saying, well, could it be that all beings are in fact dependent or not? And this is where he comes up with his argument. So let me just pull that up for you guys. Okay, let me pause it while I bring that up. All right. Okay, so premise one of Samuel Clarke's argument is a disjunction here. So either there is A, just an infinite series of dependent beings with nothing external to that infinite series, or else B, there is also, in addition to that infinite series of dependent beings, an independent or self-existent being that explains the existence of that infinite series of dependent beings. Moving on, premise two of his argument, if A, well, then there simply is no explanation for the existence of the series itself. So he's looking for an explanation, an external explanation of this infinite series itself, the whole collection. And if there just is an infinite series of dependent beings, well, then obviously there is no external explanation to speak of. So that's what premise two is saying. But there is an explanation. Okay, so he's saying, but here in premise three, but there is an external explanation for that infinite series of beings. I should have wrote that in there, including things like a series. So this is where he's throwing in the principle of sufficient reason. It's an explanatory and or in some cases can be modified to be a causal principle. In this case, it's an explanatory principle that says everything needs an external explanation of its existence, including infinite series. So an infinite series of dependent beings does in fact require an external explanation of its existence. Therefore, obviously, A can't be true. This is premise three is equivalent to saying not A in the disjunctive syllogism argument. So, yep, therefore, scenario A is false from 2 and 3. Therefore, conclusion 5, there is an independent or self-existent being who explains the existence of this infinite series of dependent beings from premises 1 to 4. Note again, it's important to note, just like with Thomas Aquinas, Samuel Clarke, he doesn't mention God here at all. So again, if you want to say, therefore, it's God, that would be an invalid argument. If you had a premise 6 or conclusion 6, that would be a potential issue. But Samuel Clarke doesn't necessarily go there. He just leaves it at this independent being and says, look, we all know that that's really God because we have a properly basic belief. If there's an independent self-existent being, who is that? God, we all know that. So that's his argument there. So I'll get into the evaluation of Clarke's argument. I just need to handle a couple quick things. Let me just pause this. I'll come back to this. All right, so kind of picking up from where we left off, I had to take care of some things. So I think where I left off here is I went over Samuel Clarke's argument. And so it was about 5 statements. So either there is just an infinite series of dependent beings, or there's also an independent self-existent being that explains the entire infinite series. Since we know that there can't be an infinite series of dependent beings that doesn't have an explanation, that violates the principle of sufficient reason. Therefore, we know there must be an independent self-existent being, and we obviously all know that's God. So kind of by way of evaluation of Clarke's argument, again, note the restricted nature of the conclusion. I already mentioned that. It doesn't specifically or explicitly mention God there. And Clarke's key move in this argument is that there has to be this external explanation of the series itself. Atheists and skeptics might question that. They might object and say, well, look, maybe it's possible that a collection of dependent beings is not a dependent being. So the collection itself, the set, if you will, of these dependent beings, the set itself is not a dependent being. And so the set or the collection itself doesn't need this external explanation. So it's, just like a collection of stamps. Well, the collection itself, it isn't a stamp, right? Each individual member is a stamp, but the collection of stamps, that set of stamps itself isn't a stamp. So maybe the collection itself just is the explanation. Well, I think that this kind of misses the point of Samuel Clarke's argument, right? Because obviously an external explanation of the collection itself is still required given the principle of sufficient reason. The explanation has to be external to that collection. It can't be something from within the series. None of the individual stamps explains the entire collection. But likewise, the collection itself doesn't explain why it's there. So, you have these it requires a contrastive explanation. Why is there this collection of stamps versus another collection of stamps? Or why is there a collection of stamps at all? Maybe there could have been no collection of stamps. And this requires an external, what philosophers call a contrastive explanation. Why this and not that? Why this and not nothing? And that's what applies to the stamps. And by that, you have to appeal, well, because Dale likes to collect stamps. He's an agent, free will agent. He likes to collect stamps. So he put together this collection. You go to that contrastive explanation. So yeah, I think that that's the response. This objection just misses the point. Now, there have been further objections, and I covered this in my 5-part cosmological argument series, where atheists and skeptics, they think that, well, by explaining each of the parts, that's sufficient to explain the whole collection. You don't have to appeal to some kind of external explanation to explain, or contrastive explanation to explain the whole set itself. No, just explaining every single individual part sufficiently explains the whole. And I gave that Eskimo or Inuit example as the more appropriate term nowadays in my, I think it was part 4, when I discussed the principle of sufficient reason in my 5-part cosmological series in a lot of details. But basically the atheists and skeptics will kind of say, well, look, if you go, well, why are there 10 Eskimos or Inuits standing on this given street corner, right, at this time, particular time? Well, you can go, well, I can explain why John Eskimo is here. I can explain why Bill Eskimo is here. I can explain why all 10 of these individual Eskimos are here individually, and that's sufficient. I don't need to explain the whole. Just by explaining each of the individual Eskimos and their motivation for being here, that's good enough. That explains the whole. So that's kind of the counter here. So in response to that kind of objection, some philosophers like Clarke, who obviously I'm using his slides here with modifications, but Clarke would say, well, look, some collections are like this Eskimo story, but not all of them are like that. For example, that stamp collection, that does still require an external explanation. Or he also gives this motherhood human race example, right? Well, how do you explain that Dale Glover exists? Well, because my mom gave birth to me. Well, how does she exist? Because my mom gave birth to her, and so on and so forth. And you can explain every single human being through that motherhood explanation individually, explain all those parts. But that isn't sufficient. That isn't a good enough thing to explain the human race. How did that come about? For that, you have to appeal to an external explanation based on evolutionary mechanisms. There was a different creature in that, there was genetic mutations and natural selection, and over time it did this. Or you can appeal to it as a Christian theist, you can appeal to a special creation as an external explanation. Well, human beings, the human race exists because God created Adam and Eve. Then nature took over and they give birth and birth and birth all the way to me, or to class Cray. So that's the first response, is to say, look, we can admit this Eskimo counter objection of the atheists and skeptics, but that does nothing to destroy Clarke's argument, because look, some types of collections don't require external explanations, but others do. And when we're talking about the Samuel Clarke's argument about all things in nature and stuff like that, or the universe, that is the type of collection that does require an external explanation. So that's one response. I would also say that actually the Eskimo, I personally would disagree or go beyond what my prof, class Cray, does. And I would say, no, actually the Eskimo is requiring an external explanation, namely coincidence or random luck or something like that. That I think provides an external explanation. It's coincidence kind of thing. And I know that's controversial in philosophy, but as I said in my cosmological argument, I went into more details in my 5-part series why I think that can indeed count as an external overall explanation, and provides that contrastive explanation for why all 10 of those Eskimos or Inuits are on that street corner at that time. So I would include that. Okay. The other objection that atheists and skeptics can give to Clarke's version of the argument is to object to the principle of sufficient reason. So for example, I remember Skydive Phil objected to the principle of sufficient reason in his book, Still Unbelievable, which he did with all those SNS skeptics back in the day, responding to Justin Brierley's argument. And I thought this was totally nuts at the time. But that's where we come into, again, in my cosmological argument, part 4, I go into the fact that there are various versions of the principle of sufficient reason. How strong is it? I think certain stronger versions by people like Leibniz, Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz, those are objectionable. Those should be rejected. They're not true. They can't be true. And they raise inevitable problems or contradictions and that sort of thing. But if you go for a weaker, watered down version of the principle of sufficient reason, then that of course applies. And Samuel Clarke's version of the argument here doesn't necessarily hinge on using a stronger version of the PSR. It can go for one of the more plausible and viable weaker versions of this principle, and therefore that avoids this objection by atheists and skeptics, in my opinion. Now, how do we know that this principle is sufficient reason is true? Well, if you remember in my part 4 of my cosmological argument, I went into a lot of depth. I gave about like 5 to 6 positive arguments in favor of it, including a modal argument that I think is just knocked down, destroys any atheists and skeptics who want to deny it, as well as some counter arguments by atheists and skeptics, and I refuted all of those. I think I gave about 4 to 5 counter or negative evidences against the principle of sufficient reason and a response. But again, this is a historical survey of cosmological arguments. So what do I think that Samuel Clarke would have responded if he wanted to prove that the principle of sufficient reason was true? And on that front, I think, number one, he would just say, look, it's intuitively obvious. In other words, it's a properly basic belief. Again, he wouldn't have had that term back then, but still, he would just say, look, it's intuitively obvious. It's self-evident that the principle of sufficient, principle of sufficient reason is true. You're an utter fool if you dare deny it. The second thing that a lot of atheists and skeptics might use is, look, it's an empirical generalization, inductive reasoning, based on our experience of everything in the world, including collections of things in the world. these all require a sufficient reason or explanation to explain their existence and or whatever they're doing. So it's an empirical inductive generalization, and that provides a basis for believing that it's true or probably true. And finally, there's a presuppositional type, tag almost type argument, where they just say, look, it's a fundamental presupposition of reason itself. You can't reason unless the principle of sufficient reason is true. Again, you're an utter fool, and fool in the biblical sense, meaning you just lack all discernment if you deny the truth of this obviously true principle in philosophy. This is a fundamental, foundational principle in order for all reasoning to work. So I think those are the three things that, if Samuel Clarke was pressed, he would provide these to try and justify that the principle of sufficient reason, or his premise 3, is true. But yeah, bottom line is that some version of the PSR must be reasonable to believe. If any of the cosmological arguments are to work, they always presuppose or argue for some kind of principle of sufficient reason, an explanatory principle, or a causal principle of one sort or another. Without that, all cosmological arguments will fail. So that's it in terms of the cosmological arguments. Son of a gun, please tell me I was sharing my screen that whole time. I wasn't. Okay, well, that sucks, but I'll post up the slides on my blog for you guys, so at least you can follow along that way and do it audibly. I thought I was sharing my screen with the slides. I'm an idiot, but what can you do? All right, cool. So with that said, I don't know, this is really, really short. So I'm going to think about it. I'm going to stop recording for a second, and maybe I'll throw in a design argument, historical design argument from William Paley. Let me just see how long this recording is. So for now, it's will be done. If it's already long enough for a nice short bonus video on the cosmological arguments, and I post that out, I'll do the design argument next week, assuming my guests again are postponing until later in October, and that I'll do William Paley's design argument. If this is short enough, then maybe I'll tack on William Paley's thing onto this video, and I'll take a break on October 8th or the following weekend and just take a week off before I get back into my shroud guests or other main guests of the show. So yeah, with that said, have a great week, and or I'll see you in a little bit for the design argument. All right, hello and welcome back. So yeah, I'm going to be continuing on. I'm going to do an add-on to the historical cosmological arguments that I was talking about earlier. And I want to do a historical design argument, or its design arguments are sometimes known as fine-tuning arguments, fine-tuning of the universe in particular, or sometimes it's on biological systems or the solar system, or sometimes they're known as teleological arguments. Basically, it's just saying, look, this thing in the universe and or the universe itself and its features have been intelligently designed, therefore that intelligent designer is God. And looking at it from a historical perspective for this kind of quick bonus show, I want to look at William Paley's version of the intelligent design argument. So let me just share my screen here. All right. All right, so once again, I'm utilizing Class Cray's great philosophy of religion slides here and the work that he did. I would have just put up his recorded lectures for you guys just because he's a much better speaker than I am. But I don't know how the copyright works. So yeah, I'm just using the slides, and I'll give my own take based on the slides that he's saying, so that at least I can share the knowledge for you guys and help you guys out. So yeah, so William Paley, he existed in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century. He's really famous for this argument from design that he gave. And he's also infamous at the same time. So a lot of fundamentally skeptics who are really ignorant and foolish kind of bash this guy and think he was an idiot. Oh, how dumb could he be, and that sort of thing. Obviously, he was a product of his time, and he didn't know about certain things in evolutionary mechanisms when it came to the design of biological aspects. So I think he advocated for something called the fixity of species, right? So he could say that species were designed by God. Well, we know now that natural selection, genetic mutation, can account for some kinds of microevolutionary changes. It's much more controversial whether they can do so for macroevolutionary changes. Again, micro and macroevolutionary, in terms of defined as creationists, would use those terms. And yeah, so there's that. But yeah, I want to look at his design argument for the universe in general, and basically his infamous or famous thought experiment of the watchmaker. So basically, in his paper, he gives a thought experiment of walking along the beach, and maybe you stumble upon a stone. You look at it, you pick it up, yeah, nothing special, you throw it away. It's just natural. Chaos created it, natural laws and chance. There's nothing special there. There's no design. Now, let's take a different example. You're walking in that same field or on that beach, you stumble upon a watch. You pick it up, you look at it, you find out there's two key facts about this watch. Number one, it has certain parts. It has springs and needles on the watch hands and glass and a whole bunch of stuff. And all these parts function together to serve an overall purpose, goal, or teleos in the Greek, which just means end goal or purpose. And secondly, if you were to change any one of those parts, well, the watch wouldn't work anymore. It wouldn't serve that function, that overall purpose or teleos anymore. Well, if you find that these two things, this is what differentiates, according to Paley, the watch from the stone. In the latter case, we can surely conclude, well, that watch was designed, intelligently designed. And we know who, it was by human beings. It was us. We know that from experience. Whereas the stone, I can't detect any design. There's no parts that function together for an overall teleos or purpose. And still functions as a rock, whether you take out part of it or not. Okay, so now Paley in his article, again, I'm going to post this Paley's paper on my blog page so you can read it with your own eyeballs and stuff like that. I always do that. But just some objections that Paley anticipates. Obviously, again, Paley wouldn't have anticipated modern evolutionary theory or the neo-Darwinian synthesis with new mechanisms that didn't exist. He didn't even know about genes back in his day and stuff like that. So that's not fair. But he did consider certain objections that do carry forward today. You have people like Richard Dumbboy Dawkins giving these same stupid objections that have been refuted centuries ago by William Paley himself. And they think it's a good objection. But let's look at some of these. So, okay, a first objection. Well, look, we only know that the watch is intelligently designed because we've observed watches. It's our empirical inductive experience of watching watches be designed by human beings, intelligent design. We've seen it. We know where watches come from. That's really the only reason that we infer that the watch is designed whereas stones are not. And then the atheist or the skeptic, thinking he's smart, will say, but what if you've never seen a watch before? You couldn't conclude it was intelligently designed then, could you? You know, they use atheists and skeptics these days, honestly. Okay, that's my humor for today. But yeah, Paley responds to this nonsense by saying, that's totally irrelevant, you fool, as an atheist. No, it doesn't matter, because we still have these two criteria. And that's all you need to infer intelligent design. And so in the case of the universe, the design of the universe, who gives a rat's patoot if we only have one universe and we can't compare and contrast it to other universes and stuff like that? So long as the two conditions above are met, we know we can infer design. So that's Paley's response to this typical atheist and skeptic objection. Another one is the bad design argument. So Paley anticipates this and says, well, look, what if the watch and or the universe is imperfect in some way, or it shows there's a bad design? Does that mean we can't make a design inference? And Paley says, oh my goodness, you're hurting my brain, atheists and skeptics. Are you that foolish? No. I mean, let's pretend the watch is badly designed. It looks like a piece of garbage, and oh, the second hand isn't ticking properly. It kind of jolts and jiggles a little bit before it moves on. And, you know, the watch is badly designed. Some guy screwed up. Well, we would still know the dang thing was designed. You would still be an utter fool to deny the proof that it's designed on the basis of the fulfillment of these two criteria. The parts function together to serve an overall purpose, or at the very least, they're attempting to serve that purpose, even if they're doing so badly. And the change of the parts won't let it work anymore. No, you would still conclude it's designed. Intelligent design is intelligent design, even if it turns out to be badly designed. So that's a foolish objection, according to Paley. There's a third objection he anticipates where he says, well, look, the watch or the universe, maybe it has inscrutable or unnecessary parts, and therefore we wouldn't be able to infer design on that front. Well, Paley replies, look, that's totally irrelevant. It comes down to these two necessary and sufficient criteria, according to Paley's view. And again, you know, some people might deny that they are necessary and sufficient, but Paley thinks that they're necessary and sufficient. And he says, look, that's all you need. Any bells and whistles or unnecessary parts, who cares? You can put frilly little leaves, or maybe you can put unnecessary parts like fancy diamonds in a watch. It's still a watch, and it's still intelligently designed. You'd be a fool if you said, well, there's an unnecessary diamond in my watch, so it must be fit. We can't infer that it was designed. No. Well, what about inscrutable parts? Maybe it has parts that we just can't figure out what the heck is this. So the guy who designed a watch put some stupid nonsensical message on it, you know, Egyptian or some kind of Chinese letters or something, and it's inscrutable to us. I can't figure out what this guy's doing or what these things are on my watch. Again, irrelevant. We still know from the fulfillment of these two necessary and sufficient conditions that it was intelligently designed. It doesn't matter if it has little bits on it that are inscrutable to us. Who cares? Doesn't matter. That's how Paley responds to that. Finally, we have a fourth and final objection here, where atheists and skeptics might say, well, perhaps this watch or the universe was caused by an earlier machine. And perhaps going beyond that, we had an infinite regress of earlier machines that made this thing all the way leading up to this watch that we find on the beach. Or same deal in the case of the universe. It's an earlier universe creating machine, and so on and so forth out to infinity. Well, Paley just shakes his head and says, are you atheists and skeptics all right in the head? You've just proved absolutely intelligent design. And then we have an even stronger case. Why? Because this is so amazing. Look, the whole system was designed. If you're telling me there's a machine that made the watch, and a machine that made the machine that made the watch, and a machine that made blah, 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 all the way back out, and or the same deal with the universe, you foolish atheists have just proved that God exists, because you've just proved that whole system, that entire infinite regress of machines, building machines, building machines, building machines, building the universe, and or building that watch, that whole thing is designed. And the proof for that is even amazingly much more stronger than it would have been if you just had the watch alone. So thank you, atheists and skeptics. With this objection, you prove intelligent design. So that's how Paley would kind of respond to that sort of objection there. And it's interesting to note, so Paley, he actually thinks his design argument is vastly superior to any of the cosmological arguments, historical ones that we looked at, because it avoids various problems that atheist philosophers have cooked up during his time to respond to people like Thomas Aquinas and that sort of thing. Okay, so how does Paley's argument work here? And it's basically an analogical argument, or an argument from analogy. Now, arguments from analogy are a special subset or a special type of inductive argument, whereby inductive arguments just allow us to say that, well, if the premises are true and then the conclusion is probably true. It doesn't prove that it guarantees the conclusion is true. They're not truth preserving the same way a deductive argument is. But analogical arguments are inductive in that they prove the conclusion to be probably true, given the truth of the premises and assuming that the argument is cogent. Cogency for inductive arguments is this similar concept referring to the logical relationship between the premises and conclusions, whereas with deductive, we would say that it's a valid argument. So cogency is just the equivalent of a valid argument. For deductive arguments, we would call an inductive argument cogent. So yeah, obviously he's trying to compare the watch to the universe in this case. And the way that analogical arguments work is basically they have to say, well, look, object A, this watch, has a certain property. It has these, in Paley's case, it has these two properties where the parts work together for an overall teleos or goal or purpose. And secondly, if they take away any of the parts or change the parts, it won't work for that intended teleos or purpose. So those two properties are inherent in a watch. So that's the analog device. Well, then premise two is that, well, object A and object T, your target object, in this case, the universe, they are relevantly similar to a sufficient degree. Both those elements are key to the success of an argument from analogy. So then he concludes, therefore, probably object T has property P, meaning it's been intelligently designed. And we know this because object A, that watch, from fulfilling those two conditions, it has property P. It is intelligently designed. So I kind of screwed that up a bit, but yeah, so property P is it's intelligently designed. We know it's intelligently designed because of the fulfillment of those two conditions that I mentioned about its parts and that sort of thing. Okay, so notice that there's two aspects here. In order to make a successful, inductively strong argument from analogy, number one, it has to be similar in the appropriate or relevant way. So this is a qualitative criterion. It means it's got the same features that are correct for establishing that they would be this, both object A and object T would be the same. And it also holds those similar relevant properties to a sufficient degree. This is a quantitative criterion here. So that's how you have to fulfill those two aspects to have a successful argument from analogy. Okay, so knowing that, let's reconstruct William Paley's argument in standard form, in premise format. So premise one, machines are produced by intelligent design. That's what the watch is a machine for him. Two, the universe sufficiently and appropriately resembles a machine. Therefore, probably the universe was produced by intelligent design. So clearly this first part of the argument, this is a cogent argument in terms of that strict logical relationship. Yep, absolutely. If the premises, both of these premises are true, then it is more probable than not that the universe has this analogical property of being intelligently designed. So this is cogent. Obviously, it's a question, well, is it inductively strong? Are, in fact, both of these premises true or not? Are they false? In which case, it would be an inductively weak argument. Okay, but there's also a second phase to Paley's argument. So he goes on, premise four, if something was produced by intelligent design, then it was produced by an intelligent being, or agent, perhaps you might say. Premise five, the universe is much more complex than any human contrivance. Therefore, probably, the universe was produced by a very intelligent and powerful, or it should probably say complex being, namely God. So that's, I would say, his argument in a nutshell and premise format here. Obviously, once again, the second part of the argument is deductive for the most part. This should say complex, I think, rather than powerful, but we get what he means. He means complex and powerful. I guess he would say the same thing. So yeah, this is a cogent inductive argument. Both parts are cogent. Are they inductively strong? Let's get to our evaluation here. So in the first place, there are some general limitations on the stage 2 argument. Notice that stage 2, it doesn't prove that there's one designer, that there could be multiple designers that worked in conjunction with each other. It doesn't prove a personal designer. Now this is a slide from Class Cray. I'm going to disagree with him actually, because so Cray is kind of saying, well, it doesn't prove a personal designer. Maybe there was some kind of impersonal force or principle that was responsible of karma, or some Eastern religions hold to this. Maybe that did it, an impersonal designer of some sort. And I've kind of addressed this in my work, as well as Bill Dembski has refuted this. If you've got intelligent design, that proves, I would say by the same token, an intelligent agent or personal being or a personal designer. I think the two go hand in hand. Once you've got intelligence, I don't think it makes sense. And again, this is a historical survey. I kind of go over that in detail based on William Dembski's reasoning in my show on miracles. It was a solo show on miracles I did. I posted a long time ago, talking about specified complexity and how we infer intelligent design from based on that criteria, the explanatory filter, and how that translates into inferring an intelligent agent and or personal being, namely God, based on that. But given this is a historical survey show, none of that existed in terms of William Paley's time. So yeah, I would just kind of say, I think that William Paley could respond to this and say, no, if it's an intelligent design, then it's an intelligent designer. And if it's an intelligent designer, that means it's personal. You can't have intelligence without being personal, kind of thing. It's a sufficient condition. But yeah, other problems. Look, we don't know whether this designer still exists at all. We don't know whether he's a morally good designer. There's a whole host of problems here. So to say that it's God, this argument doesn't prove that in terms of all his attributes. You can't prove he's morally perfect. Can't prove he's omnipotent. We can't prove he's omniscient. We can't prove a whole host of divine attributes here. In terms of stage 1, obviously premise 2 is the controversial premise. And remember, it's because they have to be similar in those 2 specific ways, qualitatively speaking. So they have the same relevant properties that are relevant for concluding they would be the same in terms of having this other target property. And secondly, they're similar to the sufficient degree. So that's that quantitative condition. So looking at the first aspect here is the problem is, well, maybe the universe contains machine-like systems, right? So it's got these two conditions about the parts for an overall teleos and that sort of thing. And what was the second one? Oh yeah, if you take away any of the parts, it won't work. But look, you're just looking at examples in the universe, and that's a fallacy of composition, right? Just because the parts, we can infer intelligent design on parts of the universe that have these 2 conditions, that doesn't mean we can extrapolate and say that the universe as a whole was intelligently designed because it displays the fulfillment of these 2 conditions. That's the fallacy of the composition, according to atheists and skeptics. I don't find this objection to be convincing at all. I think it's just ad hoc, desperate reasoning on the part of atheists and skeptics. There's no reason to suppose that the universe as a whole is any different than its parts in terms of our ability to infer intelligent design on the basis of these 2 criteria. Obviously, I think you can question whether these 2 criteria are indeed sufficient to infer intelligent design, though. I think there may be some debate there, and obviously there's been subsequent work by William Dembski, for example, and others, but I like William Dembski's specified complexity. A thing that has specification in terms of corresponding to an independent pattern, and the event is complex and that it's improbable to occur, given a saturated probability in relation to its probability bound for that given event. I think that's the way to go about inferring intelligent design. So there have been kind of updates to William Dembski's criteria, but his criteria are definitely indicative of intelligent design. And I think that there's a good debate there that, yeah, if those two conditions are correct, then yeah, you are rational in saying probably there's intelligent design going on here. Certainly that's more probable than its negation in my humble opinion. So yeah, this objection just doesn't matter. Those two conditions are necessary and sufficient conditions for detecting intelligent design on a balance of probabilities. And there's nothing about the universe that is relevantly or provably different compared to the things in the universe, like a watch or the solar system, the movement of the planets, whatever you want to say is intelligently designed as a part of the universe. There's nothing that's relevantly different on that front that would allow us to say, well, the analogy doesn't work. And take an example of where Paley's argumentation does fail in the field of biology. That's because we can prove that actually biological organisms are not relevantly similar to machines, right? They have provably different mechanisms that apply for them and can explanatorily account for at least some of the features on a microevolutionary scale, at least. Again, microevolution, using the creationist terminology there, because I know that atheists and skeptics have a less clear, more ambiguous phrase. They would accept macroevolution, but really what they're saying is how creationists define microevolution. They're just, what they call macroevolution is really microevolution according to creationists. So it doesn't matter, a rose by any other name smells just as sweet, but I just want to clarify that, yeah, I'm using certain terms in a specific way here to make my point. But the point is, yeah, there's natural selection. Paley didn't know totally about that in his day. Genetic mutation, Paley had no clue about that, or genetic drift, lateral gene transfer, all of these various mechanisms that Paley had no clue about. And it can be argued by an atheist or a skeptic that, well, in terms of the inferring intelligent design of biological organisms, there are different mechanisms that apply there that don't apply to a watch or don't apply to the universe as a whole. And this makes it different. We can't infer intelligent design. We can't say that they're sufficiently like a machine-like system in the same way a watch is. And therefore, the analogical argument would break down and not work, or at least not work as well, hypothetically speaking. But there's nothing like that. In the case of the universe as a whole, it's just physical parts and atoms. There's nothing that's really that different, unless atheists and skeptics just ad hocly make up stuff. I mean, Richard Dumboy Dawkins follows a cosmologist, Lee Schmolin, who he's kind of like a Darwinian of universes. He thinks there's this natural selection of a multiverse out there and stuff, and survival of the fittest between the universes. Complete nonsense and bunk, but I'm just saying, like, that could be a potential way that someone would try to say, well, actually, the universe is disanalogous to the watch, and then you would need to argue that. I don't buy it. I think that the universe is perfectly analogous or sufficiently analogous to a watch to infer design. Okay, and then the next part is, well, is it right? Is the universe like a machine to the right degree, that quantitative criterion? Is there enough of that property, those two properties, to say that it's sufficiently similar? Well, I mean, how many parts does it take to infer design with a watch? Well, it's got a spring, it's got this. Perhaps that's where Michael Behe's irreducible complexity criteria might play a role and stuff. Like, can we argue that the universe is irreducibly complex in some way? That's what you would have to do. Again, I haven't assessed it, so I'm kind of agnostic. I don't know. I haven't seriously considered that through the lens of Paley's two conditions about the parts playing an overall teleos and then not doing it. Again, if I were to do a teleological argument, I would probably, or a fine tuning or a design argument for the universe, I would definitely prefer to use more modern criteria and look at it through the lens of specified complexity rather than just Paley's too simplistic criteria about the parts playing an overall purpose. But obviously that's important for Dembski's as well. And also if you take away the parts, they no longer work. I think that more might be needed than just the fulfillment of those two conditions. But yeah, who knows that? So that's it in terms of my take on Paley there. So that kind of finishes our historical survey of the two cosmological arguments, one from Thomas Aquinas, his second way on the efficient cause of all natural things, and also the Samuel Clarke's cosmological argument. And and now we've done this, I've thrown in this argument from design, this teleological argument from for the universe from William Paley as well. So yeah, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed. Gave you guys a little something. Again, I didn't prepare. This wasn't an in-depth thing. I was really just kind of basing it on the lectures that my former professor Class Cray, former boss that I worked for, in his philosophy of religion class, and I wanted to share that with you guys. So I gave you guys a little something this week. And that hopefully next week I'll have my first Shroud Wars, a special guest on the show. If not, I'll throw together another quick thing, and for sure by the next week I'll have my first guest show with the Shroud guys on. So yeah, look forward to that. And otherwise, have a great week. Take care.